Hello, everyone. My name is Bridget. Welcome again to Watch It Be, the podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I have the privilege of interviewing my good friend, economic analyst, like guru, market analyst of all things Ghana. He has great perspective about the continent as well. So today, our conversation is going to center around what's going on in Ghana and what that means for people in Ghana and for people in the diaspora who are truly passionate about, the country and the continent's development. So without further ado, I'm going to do my virtual claps, clap, clap, clap. Welcome, Patrick Stephenson.
It's always good to catch up and have a conversation like this with you. But,
Yes.
Well, hello to all your listeners and all your viewers. My name is Patrick Stephenson, and I currently work as the head of policy research at the Humani Center for Policy and Education. But like all millennials, I have my fingers and hands in all kinds of pies. From understanding the economy itself, what government policy is, what it means for certain industries, to investment advisory services as well, doubling up on financial journalism on a number of things. And I don't only operate in the Ghanaian market, so I'll do some work in Nigeria and Zambia, South Africa and Angola as well. So, generally, I have a fair idea of what is happening, in these markets.
Right.
And I'm more than happy to have a conversation like this, to just throw lights on exactly what's happening across a number of value chains. And for you in the diaspora, hey, we hear last year you brought 1.9 billion, right? So hey, let's hope that there's more where that came from.
The diaspora has shut down. No, remittance money is going to be a third of what we saw last year, but it's all so complicated and nuanced, but we'll get into that. To contextualize, right? Last year seemed like a good economic picture for the country, primarily because we were able to elevate the conversation around tourism. What's your perspective on just where the economy stands right now, coming from kind of like that hallmark year of celebration and advancement in 2019?
Well, so that's a very good way of setting this conversation too, because if we go anything beyond that time period, we may lose sight of exactly what is truly happening on the ground at the moment. I think that what is happening re-COVID is not something that anybody saw. That's for starters, right? Nobody saw the potential economic impact of what is going on. And so I think for the country, just like every other market, it's almost taken a toll on the economy. A lot of plans have been blown out of the water. If you think of the fact that in only November last year, we outlined the economic management plan and strategy for Ghana, for the year 2020, just in November, right? And then December, and by November, you're already seeing cases, of this development in China, in Wuhan. And then all of a sudden by December, January, this thing is scaled back. If anybody knew at the time, right, then you would have been able to make projections around that, probably account for it.
Right.
But we didn't.
Right.
To put things in perspective, at the time, for example, what the Ministry of Finance had been projected as this receipt from the sale of crude oil, for instance, it had projected a price of about $62.5 per barrel. We're hoping to raise quite a significant amount of money to support the fiscal strategy of government for the year. Well, now, because of COVID, that price is tanked. In some cases, it's gone into negative territory.
Right.
Even if it recovers and comes back and smoothens up to about maybe $30 or $40 a barrel, that's still a knockoff on the fiscals of government that it didn't account for, right? And so it's not something we saw. If we have to narrow down away from, let's say the extractive sector, for instance, and look purely at the tourism industry that you talked about, I think that the activities of the people in the diaspora, Ghanaians in the diaspora, Africans in the diaspora, has really done is to change the outlook of the African economy in a number of fronts. One, on remittances. Today, the conversation has changed. If you look at the profile of remittances that we had in the past, now the numbers have gone up. A lot of it is moving away even from domestic consumption. Typically, you have people who would have sent money for people to just, buy goods and services here and there. Now it's moved away from that. You've seen things, money being invested, things like real estate, not only in the Ghanaian market, another market. You've seen transitions from that into small and medium scale businesses. So another form of financing for the African economy and the Ghanaian economy has been remittances, for instance. And so if you have to balance that against the developments we are seeing today, that's going to be battered, because if you're in the diaspora now, you're struggling to, probably keep your own ends connected there. And so you're not looking to be, pushing cash down back home. But we hope that the time horizon is not reset back. Away from that, I think that if we take the tourism industry as a whole, there are different components. So you have people who are providing, recreational activities. You have people who are providing, accommodation facilities. You're talking hotels, conferences, et cetera, et cetera. Already, the innovation you are seeing in technology, with people like Airbnb and other sorts of, business models that were coming up, was acting as some sort of a disruption, realigning the industry, the tourism industry itself, in a number of ways. What COVID has done is to accelerate that. And beyond that acceleration, it has battered completely, the accommodation component of that of that accommodation sector of that industry. And so what you have seen is, hotels are now operating something at about, near zero capacity, right? And that's not what, business models in there are used to. I mean, they're used to having at least, if not for anything at all, on the average, about 50-60% occupancy, which was not ideal, but was fine. But in the last 3 months, if you're running a hotel, and here I'm talking about the most sophisticated hotels that have capacity, they have the human capital to be able to navigate some of these things, right? If La Palm Royal Beach is struggling and had to shut down for about 3 months, then that's a problem. If, all the sophisticated hotels in the region enclave, which happen to be a creme de la creme in the city of Accra, then that's a worry. So what I have seen from the government's point of view in trying to support, businesses we have within the economy at the moment, I'm not sure it has properly captured these sorts of businesses and the impact that, the development is having on them. The primary focus has been on the small and medium scale businesses, because that forms a greater part, of the economy and the workforce of the country. And so that sector is really in for a hard time. And I'm not sure what strategies, will look like for them beyond, the aggressive mechanisms of cutting back on labor and then, trying to see if the business is going to get afloat at some point. So it's not really easy. There's still very challenging times that they have to navigate. I think the primary impact for most African countries is tourism. And the reason is the tourism sector is because, if you look at the structure of the economic profile of most of the African countries, I think it starts off from the services sector. Yeah, we've had a Greek that employs a lot of people, but in terms of contribution to output in the last couple of years, a lot of, growth has been happening in the services sector. And a greater part of that is sitting in that in financial services or tourism. Right. And then some other government-related services. And so I wouldn't even say, the direct impact has been the extractive industry. What has happened is the reason the extractive industry is exposed is what consumption you are seeing in China, and then the excess supply that we have seen in other markets. And so COVID is affecting that, but it's indirect. It is going through other media before it eventually hits the extractive industry we have in Africa. But there are others that are getting a direct impact. And I think tourism is going to be one of those, right? Right. The challenge, however, has been, in order to deal with COVID, you are seeing things like a restriction of movement and a shutdown of certain sectors of the economy. So that's where the direct impact for most African countries are. And when you take that, tourism is battered, small and medium scale businesses are battered. So regardless of whichever value chain they are operating in, they're all battered as we speak. And so, yes, at the top level, if you look at the fiscal position of most governments on the African continent, yes, they will complain that they are exposed, to their inability to export products now at the moment. There are challenges on fiscal revenues from the sale of crude oil, for example. And there's a number of countries that have that level of exposure.
All right. So we know that economies are being hit hard, specifically in tourism, because there's no movement. When you talked about, some of the creme de la creme of the hotels in Accra being shut down, is that trickling down? I suppose it is, but is that trickling down to labor? Because according to some recent reports, it's like tourism, I think, hires like third or so in Ghana. So
I will say it's an accurate representation of what dynamics we have around the labor industry really is. Because if you take the total labor profile of a country like Ghana, for example, majority of the people are employed in agriculture. I mean, something around, between 40 and 50%. I think the last I saw 42% of the total labor force being employed directly in agriculture. The next is the services industry. Not typically people would assume that because of the assumptions we usually have in economic development theory that agri industrialization and transition services is not the case.
Right.
A greater percentage of the people are now employed in the services sector, and that makes a lot of sense because that sector has been driving growth for a certain number of years now.
Right.
And if you decouple that services industry, if you take government alone, right? Government essentially provides a service, right? So if the government decides to shut down, the government is buttered, well, that's a part of the labor force of the government that's gone. Right. And so most people that you will find working for government, for example, and government accounts for about 50% of the total formal labor employment, right? So if that number is somewhere around 1.2 million, given data from the social security services, that's about 600,000 people who, plus or minus, even if 60 or 70% of that have to go home or have to work in different forms, that's going to have implications on the labor market profile. If we narrow that down to the hotel industry, the way you should see this is that if the hotel does not work, people who do maintenance will not go to work. Mm-hmm. Every person who's working on the front end in the hotel will not go to work. The chef does not go to work. The person who's doing routine maintenance does not go to work. The chauffeur, the valet, everybody is out.
Right.
So it's not like other sectors where you can still get some functions working. If the tourism industry just shuts down, that's gone. It's gone. Okay. And there are implications as well for the transport industry, because typically if these places are occupied and people have conferences or you have people who are traveling into, some of these other recreational areas, all of that is part of the value chain that employs people directly or indirectly, formally or non-formally.
Right.
Now, all of that is somewhat gone. And so anybody who produces a report that has a conclusion like what you have arrived at, I think is probably looking in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And it just shows the level of exposures that our labor market has, because we don't seem to be diversified in skill sets. We don't seem to be diversified in understanding the emerging dynamics around, labor markets across the world and what emergence of technology, for example, means for how we can work. Because if we had an understanding of these, for instance, maybe you may shut down the hotel, but some functions of the hotel could actually work. Okay, today Zoom is all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe some hotels could still have been able to manage and host some conferences virtually. I'm not sure what the dynamics around that is going to look like, but people still have jobs. Right. But now it's not the case. We haven't focused on it, and so we don't understand what the pertinent solutions really will look like for that sector.
Makes sense. So then let me take you on the comment you made about government kind of focusing its response on, let's say, small and medium-sized enterprises, right? I want you to talk about what that response has been and why. And you mentioned that there's been an absence of like a strong government response or support for, let's say, the tourism industry vis-a-vis hotels, right? What could you have imagined would have been supportive during this time that was possible, right? Because I don't want us to talk about things that we know realistically African governments can do. I know nobody's about to cut a $1 trillion check, so let's be realistic.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think a very useful one at that. Look, all governments everywhere would have loved to have a blank check that in a time like this they can just write for everybody and solve a problem.
Right.
The reason why the governments are struggling is a fundamental problem we've had in economics. Else, we're all not going to be in business, right? You don't have sufficient resources. How do you navigate constraints that exist? Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about governments that, by their nature, think or operate as though they are the giver of all, right? It will presuppose that when they put together a plan for the economy at any point in time, that plan would have considered all possible social protection programs that they need to provide for people who typically fall through the cracks in the economy. Bottom line, they have to account for that in planning for an ensuing year. Now, if that plan gets derailed for any reason, the immediate response will usually not be big corporations, unless the economy is structured such that big corporations actually employ like 60 or 70% of the population. That it will make sense. And if you permit me to give just a few examples, in 2007, 2008, when we had a global financial crisis, a spiral from the US to Europe, etc., the strategy at the time to rescue some big corporations was simply because they are too big to fail. And I disagree with too big to fail. I disagree with government interventions as an ideology. But at the time, these are companies, billion-dollar bottom lines. Yes, you may hold a few CEOs who supervise bad transactions accountable, but if you let them die, they were employing large volumes of people.
Right.
Beyond employing large volumes of people on the supply side, on the demand side as well, there were people who had made savings and investments with all of these institutions and mortgage firms all over the place. So you had no choice as government than to realign strategy. If we have to look at that thinking at this point in time, yeah, you have big corporations in Ghana. All the big corporations in the country at the moment, I classify as operating in the formal sector, regardless of how you look at them, right? I mean, I seem to have a funny theory that, in Ghana, businesses tend to wear the formality hat when it suits them, right? And then when they feel that there are some regulations or some religions that come up that, being formal does not help you, then they try to non-formalize or deformalize, so to speak. And that thing has serious implications for, our understanding of firm theory and things like that. But if you look at the Ghanaian economy at the moment, if that statistic that is usually bundled around, that about, 50, 60 or 70% in some cases of, businesses you have in the economy are small scale businesses, okay? Most of which are non-formal. Non-formal would mean it's probably a non-formal labor engagement or somebody operating in a market or is an employment relationship that is not properly structured with social benefits, etc. When you look at that properly, and that constitutes a bigger part of the economy, you have no business as a government dealing with the large corporates. I mean, if you try large corporates, well, then you're going to get civic actors like myself come after you because it's not a proper use of limited resources of the country. And so, which is why some of us were very excited when we saw the primary plan of the government, even though you may disagree ideologically. So, okay, we are reducing, for example, the monetary policy rate. They reduced that by about 150 basis points, which was great. That immediately meant that banks that were lending credit to some aspects of the economy, well, now you have created some room for them. And the way it works in our case is that we have reorganized our monetary policy regime such that immediately there's a reduction in the rate. You should see a reduction, in the lending rates that go to commercial businesses. But bear in mind, the problem you're dealing with is both on the demand and supply side. So you allow banks to have access to credit. Well, if businesses are not working and demand does not exist,
right,
nothing happens. So you now have to deal with the demand side. So there are a number of things they did on the supply side of financing, for example, to support businesses. Beyond the monetary policy, where they reprofiled loans, reclassified some of the loans so the bank's balance sheets can be free. Then they provided additional funding to some specific banks and specific institutions to lend that kind of money to critical businesses in the sector, most of which are small and medium scale. Having done that, you have businesses that simply won't be able to operate. If you say you have shut down Accra or shut down a particular marketplace, there are people who can't go to the market to survive. Right. And there are existing businesses that still have to provide things like food, water, and these are very small scale businesses as well. So how do you then use the size of government to unlock sufficient demand for these businesses? Which is why when they again announced that they were, the government was going to get food and some other essential services, right, products. I thought it was great because when the size of the government is big enough, that helps you break bulk and use that to support some of these businesses. And so I think that is the thinking behind the strategy of dealing with small and medium scale businesses. But it's not to say that the big businesses have been completely left out of the picture, okay, because clearly those businesses are still engaging their banks. I mean, if you're a business and you're very open, the banks equally recognize that this is a time that is unusual. And so I think that if you're open as a business and you can engage and discuss with your bankers, there's an opportunity to probably find a way around which you can manage things like credit and be able to operate sustainably. The hotel industry, however, is a service-based industry, and people are just supposed to be home. It's what it is, right? People are home. We've shut down the borders of the country. Tourists are not coming in. It is what it is. So in that case, what sort of financial support can we provide to the sector? I mean, from a practical point of view, you really can't do much than to, for example, suggest that, costs around utilities and things like that, they can be restructured in a very coherent manner that supports a turnaround strategy when business resumes, because you don't want business to resume and then these institutions are caught wanting. And so, again, it may not be the most optimal solution, but under the constraint that the government has, I think that's the best they can do. To say that some cost items that, affect the operations of these businesses, given that we shut down, this is what it is. We would have loved to see more. I mean, if the government, I suspect, had a blank check, maybe they would have, allowed people to be paid their salaries whilst they were home and things like that. But I know what could have been done in that area would have been for government, for instance, to work through maybe the National Labour Commission or some other institution of employment to suggest mechanisms by which employers and employees could engage within the interim to protect the people who had to stay home and may not necessarily earn an income. Okay, that may not mean the government parting away with money, but recognizing the need to create that forum where businesses can engage with, their employees, to create a room where everybody knows, okay, we can't be working within this period, but take a haircut on salary of about 50%, stay home, we're going to have to pay that. It cushions the business as well, and then there's some cushioning that is equally provided for you, an employee. And then when the economy is back to, sustainable operating levels, everybody finds a way of dealing with it. But I didn't get that, and I'm sure maybe it's still too early days yet. They may figure that out, I'm not sure.
But is that really possible? A case where there's some cushioning that's not coming from government, but from corporate to kind of enable this dynamic of what you're talking about, where people stay at home, but they're still being paid, and there's some exchange of skill or some exchange of value there. Do you think that was possible?
Well, it may not be possible carte blanche for every sector, okay? Depending on what sector you're dealing with, you may be able to find some sort of a solution. Because, look, at the end of the day, the business has got a responsibility not only for itself. If you don't have employees tomorrow, well, then what's the point?
Right.
And so, I guess the point I'm making is that it is a hard pill to swallow. It's a difficult pill to swallow for both the employer and the employee. Okay, and so it's important that we understand that. Bear in mind, without the significant support systems going to the non-formal sector, if we don't even provide any support systems to the non-formal sector, for example, and I'm somebody who probably runs, a small welding shop, and, I don't have to go again until all my apprentices don't come, nothing happens for them. Nothing happens in that area. And those people are going to get hungry. They're going to have to struggle. And that's a real part of the problem, the puzzle that needs to be solved. And so I guess the point I'm making is that it's not exciting for the entrepreneur, neither is it an exciting situation for the employee. Yeah. But a forum where we get to understand that it's possible to get a haircut, particularly for the formal businesses. Yes, it may be counterintuitive to what we know, but I think there's a way out of that.
So what I hear you saying is that the government's approach, right, made sense, right? Because there was this focus on SMEs who are primarily engaged, a majority of the labor force at 60 to 70%, right? Yeah. Which is different from perhaps what we're seeing now that I'm in New York City, what we're seeing here, where there were tax breaks and there were forms and, et cetera, for big business, right? Because here the opposite is true, where large corporations hire the majority of the working population. So I guess that's what I've been thinking about, just how different the responses have been because of the context in which, the government.
But there's a twist though.
Okay.
So this is the policy intent. As to its materialization, it's a completely different thing. Okay. So
we always talk about this.
Yes. So this is the intent of the policy. Fantastic. There you may see those differences clear. in an economy like the US, where you have, big corporates typically providing, the majority of the employment, it makes sense for the government to try to understand exactly what the profile is. So they have all these fantastic forms they put up. I remember coming across a few reports where, small businesses were even struggling to deal with compliance issues because they couldn't hire the very big lawyers and law firms that could help them even apply for some of the grants and financial opportunities that are available. So that
the money ended up going to a lot of the big companies, right? Which caused like public upheaval.
Of course. I mean, if you're a finance company, a big company on the streets of Manhattan somewhere, and this opportunity, you have a big law firm sitting somewhere that you can just make a phone call and then they sort everything out for you. But if you're a small business at that time, you don't have the size, you don't have capacity, you don't have the finances, you don't have the technical competences to be able to access this, let alone talk about the network to be able to plug it.
Right.
It's the reverse here. However, the vehicle through which we will get that, policy intent realized, it's a completely different game. So it is possible this intent is what is there, but you may end up with a result that is not so different from what you're seeing in the US because of the difficulty in implementing, right? Because of the difficulty in following through what they have designed, which we think is great, is fine, by the way. But you set up the government set up this special fund that, there's a private fund that is set up that I understand has raised some millions, about 90 million Ghana cedis or so in funds now. And all these fine strategies they talked about, that they're working together with the Bank of Ghana to further free up space for private sector businesses. They're doing things through the Exim Fund. They set up some extra money for a program they call the Maslock program. And Maslock typically is supposed to be providing, seed funding and loans to small and medium scale businesses. These are the vehicles through which are getting this done. If we are going to operate and execute that with very minimal, disturbance from political economy issues, fair enough. But if we throw in our political economy issues about, how we formulate and implement policy in these parts, there is a possibility that you may eventually then end up with, big corporates finding ways of still receiving this money. And I'll give a typical example through which that can happen. If I'm a big corporate and I have subcontractors and businesses, most of which are Ghanaian and are small and medium scale, and I can't operate and I can't pay them, right? Well, if they're going to find a way of getting access to such resources, if they're available, why not help them to get that? I mean, that frees up space for me. And there are cases where you have some very big companies that end up setting up their own subsidiaries that are very small businesses, and they have suppliers on the streets of Aboseukai, suppliers on the streets of Mokola, for example, that are not completely non-formal businesses, right? So if I am the corporate and I'm shut out and I don't have money, and they can get access to that, invariably I get to benefit as well. Okay, so you if you're not too careful, the ultimate results may not be so different from the case you have in the years. But I doubt it's going to be that extreme, because at the end of the day, right, I don't think we'll get to those extremities. If we account even for those political economy issues I'm talking about that could set back, I don't think we are going to get into the realms of what you are seeing in the US. At least I think the small and medium scale businesses are still going to be protected one way or the other.
Got it. But is it really an issue of political economy if a business, for example, allows its suppliers to tap into funds that are delineated for small suppliers anyway, right? And I think that's the issue. From my time in Ghana, it's like this weird intersection of informality and formality that makes it really complicated to know, like, it's actually what, right? You can't fault the corporate for, kind of allowing its suppliers to make use of this resource that has now become available.
Well, no, you can't. I mean, and these are the realities that we are going to have to be confronted with, right? So a few years ago, I tried to do a study on understanding there's a system we have in economic theory to try to see the extent to which technology adoption helps us unlock value for small and medium scale businesses, in Sub-Saharan Africa, using Ghana as a case. Now, as a result of doing that work, I came to understand the informal sector it's a very complex is a complex, system.
Right.
In fact, I think it's a very complex system that I don't think we have sufficient understanding of yet.
I can
Because every time we've looked at it as, okay, that thing that is bad that needs to be reformed and
right.
formalized. That's how we've always looked at it.
Right.
So we're always looking at that sector and juxtaposing it to what we are used to. I don't want to say used to, that what we have been made to get used to, from the streets of London, the streets of Luxembourg, the streets of New York. That's what typically happens. So I'm looking at these businesses, I'm looking at their structure, and I'm seeing something completely different. You force them, when they have to get access to credit, to go and get registered with the Registrations Department. When they have to get certifications to operate, if the person is a small restaurant on the street corner, they have to go to the FDA. All of these things, you're asking them and pushing them into an area where psychologically and socially, that's not how they have been. And they thrive in that way than the area in which you're taking them to, okay? And our inability to understand that and gradually curate that space and use policy to support them is what may lead to what you have just described. Where there's a big corporation, they know these guys will be formal when they are coming to apply for a contract from them. They wear the formal hat, which is to provide registration document, provide tax certificates, etc., etc. When they have to now go and deal with a taxman or some other regulatory agency for some other thing, they deformalize. They will no longer show up like that, and they may leverage big corporations to be able to get that. And that's the hard reality. That's a survival strategy for the businesses in the system.
I'm laughing because I've fallen into that, being in business. You do what is appropriate. Like, you wear the suit that fits, right? That's how you operate in business on the continent. And this does remind me of, and I'll move on from this point after this, but one of the things that drove me to Ghana initially was I was doing research when I came for study abroad on market formation. So I came to Ghana the first time since I had lived in the US, after like almost 12 years at that point. And appalled is the word, by like going to Makola and being like manhandled by men selling jeans. Like, this person is fooling you, this way, and I'm just like so overwhelmed. And I'm just like, this has no structure. Why aren't we using like economies of scale? Why can't we aggregate and just sell? Why can't all these jeans people just give one person their jeans and one person just sells it, right? And I didn't understand any of it. So I actually did research on that for my final economic development paper. And part of what I discovered was exactly what you mentioned, right? You see these markets as these large informal structures without any kind of hierarchy or like any organization. But when I went into Makola and you're talking to a woman, she's like, no, go and talk to this. Like, there are levels to this.
Organized chaos.
It's organized.
It's organized chaos that is functional. And you cannot force...
With value being created at different chains, the right, I guess, taxes being paid to the right stakeholders and leaders and the whole infrastructure. So I left feeling like, whoa, like this is something that is perhaps more complex and organized than some of the structures that we're seeing in the West, but we're not looking at it in that way, right? So that's a great point. Okay, so then I want to transition. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I want to transition to two last topics that I want to cover. So we've talked about the broader economy, right? What's happening in Ghana, what's been the government response, how that has implications for people's daily lives, right? Whether you're in the informal sector or the formal sector. Now, what I want to think about is two things. One, kind of the role of the African diaspora at this point, right? So we've already mentioned that there are a number of things at play, right? Last year, there was like this huge engagement. This year, we're already projecting that remittances are going to take a hit. What does that look like for you going forward? Like, what do you think could happen in the space? Like, I'm at a loss. Like, I don't know what's going to happen in December. December became a thing. Let's say it started in 2013. And now, like 7 years later, we might not see it. Hey, friends. So I'm going to stop this episode here. I know this is the part a lot of you want to hear. This is the really interesting part. Because it has real applications for you. But I'm going to stop this interview here because I want the second portion to get its own due credit, and for you to have the space and mind to actually take all of that in. So Please check this out next week as we continue this conversation. Bye. Thank you so much for listening.